The backyard still smelled of charcoal and honey barbecue sauce when she leaned in close. "Don't tell Dad," she whispered. The garage door slid shut. The music cut out, and the first punch landed, clean and quiet as a signature. The next morning, I walked into Northbridge Dynamics as if nothing had happened. Here, my stepmother wasn't just my father's wife. She was the chief financial officer. I wasn't planning on bloodshed. I was planning a slideshow. My name is Mara Quinn. I'm 32 years old, and I am the head of the data analytics team at Northbridge Dynamics. On a Saturday evening in early June, I stood in my father's backyard in the fictional perfection of Alderwick, a town built on good fences and better secrets, and watched my stepmother charm a small crowd of neighbors and colleagues. The air was thick with the sweet, smoky perfume of grilled chicken and the metallic tang of expensive beer. Strings of yellow Edison bulbs drooped between the branches of an old oak tree, casting a warm, forgiving glow on the scene. Ice clinked in glasses. Laughter, light and meaningless, floated over the manicured lawn. It was a perfect domestic tableau, a picture postcard of suburban contentment. From the outside, we were the model of a blended family: the successful widower, his polished second wife, and the devoted, hard-working daughter. Appearances were everything in Alderwick, and even more so in my father's house. Celeste, my stepmother, was the architect of this illusion. She moved through the party with an effortless grace that was both admirable and deeply unsettling. Tonight, she was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored white linen dress. Her blonde hair pulled back in a chignon that was severe yet elegant. She was the chief financial officer of Northbridge Dynamics, a position she had secured not long after marrying its founder, my father. She refilled wine glasses with a practiced flick of the wrist, her smile never wavering, her eyes scanning the crowd with the same acquisitive gleam she applied to quarterly earnings reports. She paused beside me, placing a cool hand on my arm. Her touch felt less like affection and more like an audit. "Mara, you're so quiet tonight," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the Hamiltons from next door to hear. "Always working, even in your head. Daniel, your daughter is a marvel of dedication." My father, Daniel Quinn, beamed from his lounge chair. "That's my girl. Got her mother's brains and my work ethic." I offered a tight, non-committal smile. "Just enjoying the evening, Celeste." "Of course you are," she said, squeezing my arm before gliding away to offer canapes to Harlan Mott, our interim CEO. She called me hard-working the way a biologist might label a specimen, an observable trait, devoid of warmth or praise. It was a label that served her, reinforcing the narrative of a family united in its commitment to the company my father had built from the ground up. I watched her laugh at something Harlan said, a perfectly calibrated sound of amusement. In the soft light of the party, she looked like a benefactor, a patron saint of corporate and domestic harmony. I knew the truth was written in a different ledger. The party wound down as the moon climbed higher, the cheerful chatter replaced by the murmur of polite goodbyes. The last to leave were the Hamiltons. Mrs. Hamilton gave my arm a soft pat. "It was a lovely evening. Mara, your stepmother is a wonderful hostess." I watched them disappear down the driveway, their taillights a receding red glow in the dark, and the carefully constructed atmosphere of the party evaporated like smoke. The silence that fell was heavy, charged. Celeste began clearing glasses from the patio table, her movements suddenly sharp, economical. "Don't just stand there," she said, her voice losing its public-facing velvet. "Help me with this." We worked in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clatter of plates and the distant hum of the highway. My father had already gone upstairs, pleading fatigue. He always went upstairs, when the patio was clear. Celeste wiped her hands on a napkin and looked toward the detached garage at the end of the driveway. "Walk with me," she commanded. It wasn't a request. As we approached the garage, she lowered her voice, the manufactured warmth of the evening completely gone, replaced by something cold and hard. "I saw you talking to Harlan's wife for quite a while. What was that about?" She was asking about the new data visualization software, I said, my voice even. The one we're rolling out next quarter. Is that all? Yes. She stopped at the side door and pressed the button to close the main garage bay. The heavy door groaned as it descended, sealing us off from the quiet street. The last slice of moonlight vanished, and the world shrank to the dim, dusty space smelling of gasoline and old rubber. It was then, as the motor whirred to a stop, plunging us into near darkness, that she leaned in close. The scent of her perfume, a cloying floral, filled my nostrils. "Don't tell Dad," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear. It was the same thing she had said an hour earlier, at the barbecue, a public warning that had become a private threat. She straightened up. "You think you're clever, don't you? Poking around where you don't belong. You need to learn to stop worrying your father with things that don't concern you." Before I could process the shift, her hand came up. It wasn't a slap, born of anger or impulse. It was a punch, short and precise, a closed fist striking the soft tissue just below my cheekbone. The impact was a dull, sickening thud. My head snapped to the side, and a constellation of bright, shimmering lights exploded behind my eyes. I staggered back, my feet tangling, and fell against a stack of old tires. The rough, vulcanized rubber scraped against my back. The concrete floor was cold through my jeans. A sharp, metallic taste flooded my mouth. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The smell of the garage, oil, dust, the faint, acrid scent of fertilizer was overwhelming, grounding me in the raw, ugly reality of the moment. My jaw throbbed with a deep, radiating ache. I lay there, stunned and silent, listening to the ringing in my ears. Above me, Celeste stood calmly, smoothing down the front of her white linen dress. There was no sign of rage in her expression, only a cool, dispassionate assessment, like a manager reviewing a poorly performing asset. She watched me for a moment, then walked over to the old chest freezer in the corner, its motor humming a steady, monotonous tune. She opened it, rummaged inside, and pulled out a plastic-wrapped pack of frozen peas, the makeshift ice pack of 1,000 domestic injuries. She tossed it onto my chest. It landed with a soft crunch. "Put that on your face," she said, her voice as flat and emotionless as a dial tone. "We can't have you showing up to the quarterly forecast meeting looking like a mess. You're presenting the KPI dashboard at 10. Don't be late." She turned and walked to the interior door that led into the house, her heels clicking softly on the concrete. The door opened, spilling a rectangle of warm kitchen light into the dark garage, and then it clicked shut, leaving me alone in the cold and the quiet. I stayed on the floor for a long time, pressing the freezing bag of vegetables against the blooming pain in my face. The only sound was the constant, indifferent hum of the freezer. Eventually, I pushed myself up, my body stiff, my head swimming. I walked into the house, through the pristine kitchen where everything was in its place. I caught a glimpse of myself in the dark glass of the oven door, a ghost with a lopsided face. I climbed the stairs, each step a deliberate, controlled effort. In the upstairs hallway, I could hear the sound of the shower running in my father's ensuite bathroom. Daniel, he was in there, humming off key, completely oblivious, cocooned in a world of steam and warm water, shielded from the ugliness his wife had just enacted 50 feet away. The sound of the running water was a wall between his world and mine. Inside my own bathroom, I flicked on the vanity lights. The fluorescent glare was unforgiving. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming on my cheek, a violent purple blooming under the skin along my jawline. A thin trickle of blood had seeped from the corner of my mouth and was now drying on my chin. It had soaked into the crisp white collar of my blouse, a single, damning red stain. I stared at my reflection, at the stranger looking back with my eyes. My face was a mask of shock, but my mind was already working. It was processing data, calculating variables, planning the next move. I took out my phone. My hand was steady. I angled my face to the light, capturing the fresh injury in stark, clinical detail. I took 3 pictures from different angles, ensuring the timestamp and location data were embedded. Then I opened a secure folder on my cloud drive. The folder was named Incidents. Inside, there were subfolders: March 2024, August 2024, January 2025. I created a new one, June 2025. I uploaded the photos, my movements precise and methodical. This was not a response born of emotion. It was a procedure. It was evidence collection. When I was done, I went back downstairs. I walked through the dark house and out onto the back patio. The strings of lights were still on, casting their soft, deceptive glow. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of cut grass and night-blooming jasmine. I walked over to the large, stainless steel grill. I placed my hand on the hood. It was still warm. The lingering heat felt like a memory of the party, a ghost of the happy family facade we had performed just an hour ago. Standing there, in the silent aftermath, listening to the crickets chirping their indifferent song, I made a decision. I would not scream. I would not cry. I would not run to my father. I would do exactly what Celeste had told me to do. I would go to the meeting tomorrow, and I would keep my mouth shut, for now. The headquarters of Northbridge Dynamics did not feel like a place my father had built. His original office had been a chaotic space of blueprints, half-empty coffee cups, and overflowing ashtrays. This was a different world entirely. The lobby was a cathedral of minimalist corporate power, a vast, echoing space of polished concrete floors that reflected the cold, recessed lighting from above. A massive, chrome-plated Northbridge logo was mounted on a stark white wall, so polished you could see your distorted reflection in it. The only scent was the expensive, slightly burnt aroma of artisan coffee from the in-house barista bar. It was a place designed to communicate ruthless efficiency, a sterile environment where sentimentality, like dust, was meticulously removed each night. Celeste thrived in this environment. She arrived at precisely 8:30 every morning, her arrival heralded by the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels on the concrete. She was not so much a person as a walking, breathing embodiment of a flawless balance sheet. Her smile was a standardized, pre-audited expression that conveyed authority without the messiness of actual warmth. Her suits were impeccably tailored, her movements precise. People straightened their backs when she passed. Conversations dropped to a respectful hush. She was the chief financial officer, and she moved through the office like a queen inspecting her domain, her gaze missing nothing, appraising everything. This morning, she swept past the reception desk with a crisp, "Good morning, Saya," that was both a greeting and a dismissal. Her eyes already fixed on the elevators. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. I was just another asset on the company's roster, and she knew exactly where I was supposed to be. At 10 o'clock, I was in the Sable Room, a glass-walled conference room on the executive floor. Its name, like all our meeting rooms, was taken from a type of rock, hard, dark, and opaque. I stood at the head of a long black granite table, a projector screen glowing behind me. My presentation was on the key performance indicators for the last quarter. The numbers were good. My team was exceptional. My voice was steady, professional. As I walked the executive team through trend analyses and predictive models, I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, but I was only aware of one. Celeste sat directly opposite me, her hands steepled on the table, her expression unreadable. My preparation for the day had been meticulous. A high-collared silk blouse in a deep navy blue concealed the mottled bruise on my jaw. A careful, layered application of concealer had erased the dark shadow beneath my eye, transforming the evidence of a violent blow into the more professionally acceptable sign of a sleepless night spent wrestling with deadlines. Earlier, a colleague, Jonah from IT, had passed my desk. "Rough night, Quinn?" he'd asked, gesturing vaguely at his own eyes. "You look like you've been mainlining espresso." I had simply smiled and said, "Big presentation, you know how it is." He had nodded in sympathy, oblivious. The lie was a small, necessary piece of armor. Harlan Mott, the interim CEO, sat at the head of the table. He was a man in his late 50s with a reputation for ruthless turnarounds, brought in after my father had officially stepped back to a chairman role due to his health. Harlan cared about one thing: the bottom line, and right now, the bottom line was entirely focused on the impending acquisition of a smaller tech firm, Aurora Vex. It was a massive, company-defining deal, and every department was under pressure to show flawless metrics in the run-up. The data shows a consistent 20% quarter-over-quarter growth in user engagement, I concluded, clicking to my final slide, which positions us strongly for the post-acquisition integration phase. Harlan grunted, which from him was high praise. Good work, Quinn. Clean data. Then, Celeste spoke. Excellent presentation. Mara, she said, her voice smooth as glass. Clear, concise. You have a great deal of potential. The words were a compliment, but the delivery was a calculated act of condescension. In front of the entire executive team, she had called me by my first name while I addressed her as Ms. Vancorp, her professional name. She had praised my potential, not my accomplishment, subtly framing me as a junior still in need of her approval. It was a masterful little power play, and I was the only one in the room who understood its true depth. I saw the faint, triumphant glint in her eye. It was the same look she'd had in the garage. The meeting broke up, and I returned to my desk, the low-level hum of the office closing in around me. While archiving the presentation files, I ran a routine diagnostic on the source data sets we'd used. It was a habit, a data analyst's compulsion for cleanliness. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a glaring error. It was a whisper, a slight irregularity in the cost allocation logs for the previous quarter. A line item under the M&A pre-integration budget labeled Integrated Consulting Fees. The number was large but not implausible. What was strange was its recursive nature. 3 separate payments to 3 different consulting firms, all for identical amounts, all approved on the same day. It was the kind of detail that would slip past a standard audit, which looks for large, obvious red flags, not subtle, patterned anomalies. My pulse quickened, a slow, cold drumbeat in my chest. This was not a mistake. Mistakes are random. This was a pattern. I was pulling the payment authorization codes when her shadow fell over my desk. I didn't have to look up to know it was Celeste. The faint scent of her floral perfume preceded her. "I need a word with you," she said, her voice low. I followed her to the coffee station, a small alcove that offered a brief illusion of privacy. She turned, blocking me in, her back to the open-plan office. Her professional smile was gone, replaced by a tight, unyielding line. "I reviewed the preliminary data you sent over for the Aurora Vex cost-benefit analysis," she began, her tone conversational but edged with steel. "There seemed to be some questions flagged on the consulting fees from last quarter." "I was just confirming the project codes," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "There appeared to be some duplication." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Those were sensitive, time-critical payments related to the acquisition. It's all been properly vetted. I need you to focus on the forward-looking projections, not on settled accounting." She leaned a fraction of an inch closer, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, a sound meant only for me. "Family is family. Business is business. Let's not confuse the two. It would be messy." It was a direct order and a clear threat, delivered in the bland vernacular of corporate speak. My stomach tightened. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As she stared at me, waiting for a verbal confirmation I wouldn't give, I subtly reached into my pocket and unlocked my phone. I opened my encrypted notes application. My thumb moved quickly. I created a new note. The title was simple, factual. Sable, 10:12 a.m. In the body, I typed a short, verbatim transcript of her warning, time-stamped, dated, documented. "Good," she said, satisfied with my silence. She turned and walked away, her professional mask sliding perfectly back into place as she greeted a passing colleague. I stayed by the coffee machine, my back to the room, and watched her reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine. I saw her walk about 20 feet, and then, when she thought no one was looking, the pleasant, authoritative smile she wore for the office vanished. In the warped, metallic surface, I saw her face become what it had been in the garage, a cold, hard mask of controlled fury. The reflection disappeared as she rounded a corner. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The coffee machine hissed, releasing a plume of steam. The threat had been made, the battle lines drawn. She thought she was containing a family problem, silencing a potential nuisance. She didn't understand. She had just confirmed my hypothesis. The violence wasn't random, and neither were the numbers. They were connected. They were two heads of the same monster, standing there, amidst the scent of burnt coffee and the hum of corporate machinery. I finally understood. The backyard in Alderwick hadn't been left behind. It had simply been relocated to the 40th floor. Celeste's warning in the coffee alcove was not a deterrent. It was a confirmation. It was the starting pistol for a race she didn't even know I was running. That night, I didn't go home. I waited until the office emptied, until the rhythmic clicking of keyboards faded, and the cleaning crew had made their rounds, their vacuum cleaners humming a mournful, lonely song through the deserted halls, in the silent, artificial twilight of the 40th floor, with the city of Alderwick glittering like a field of scattered diamonds below. I began to dig. My revenge would not be an emotional outburst, it would be a forensic audit. My work began with the 3 anomalous payments. They were identical to the cent, $150,000 each, not large enough to trigger an automatic high-level review, but significant enough to be meaningful. The vendors were listed as Everline Solutions, Wexel Group, and Carberry Associates. The names were deliberately, aggressively bland, designed to be forgotten, to slide through an accounts payable system without a second glance. I started by running them through a public business registration database. All 3 were limited liability companies, registered within the same week just over a year ago. All listed mailing addresses that turned out to be commercial mail drop services in 3 different states. They had no websites, no professional footprints, no history. They were ghosts, existing only as payees in the Northbridge Dynamics ledger. They were shell companies. The raw anger that had been a cold, hard knot in my stomach since the barbecue began to transform into something else, a focused, almost ecstatic clarity. She had been sloppy. The next step was to trace the authorization. I pulled the digital signatures for each payment. This, I knew, would be the firewall. A crime like this would be pointless if it could be traced back to a forged signature, but it wasn't a forgery. The approval for all 3 payments came from a CFO subaccount, a legitimate digital key with delegated authority for mid-level M&A expenditures. On paper, it was impeccable. Celeste had used the very system designed for transparency to create a perfectly opaque pipeline. The authorization was valid. The crime wasn't in the signature, it was in the destination. She had built a fortress of legitimacy around a fraudulent core. I felt a grudging respect for the architecture of the deception. It was elegant. It was clean. It was, I suspected, a reflection of her own personality. I drilled down into the project codes attached to the invoices. Here was the next layer of artistry. Each invoice was tied to a legitimate, active project code related to the Aurora Vex acquisition. However, they were duplicates of invoices for work already completed by one of our established, long-term consulting partners. Celeste had simply copied the details, changed the vendor name and bank routing number, and submitted them a second time, weeks later. The small discrepancies in timing and the sheer volume of transactions during the M&A frenzy were the camouflage. It was a brilliant piece of work, exploiting the chaos of a corporate merger to hide her own quiet, methodical theft. She was counting on no one having the time or the inclination to manually cross-reference tens of thousands of line items. She wasn't counting on me. Emotion is a liability in data analysis. It creates bias. It clouds judgment. I forced it down, compressing the memory of her fist, of the cold garage floor, into a single, dense point of fuel. I worked with a cold, methodical precision. My next step was to examine the system's access logs. Who had created these vendor profiles? Who had manipulated the invoice data? I filtered the logs by user ID and date. The entries had been made by Celeste's primary account, but the timestamps were what made my blood run cold. One entry was made on a Saturday at 11:17 p.m., the other on a Sunday, also at 11:17 p.m., 23:17. The precision was chilling. This wasn't a hurried, frantic act. This was a ritual. I pictured her, alone in the silent house or here, in this very office, the city lights her only witness, calmly and carefully weaving her digital lies. The logs were damning, but circumstantial. I needed something more. I needed intent. I began a targeted keyword search of the internal email server archives, a privilege my senior analyst role afforded me. I searched for the shell company names. For the invoice numbers, nothing. She was too smart for that. I broadened my search, using more abstract terms: special payments, discrete handling, cost legalization. For hours, I found nothing but corporate jargon. Then, I found it. It wasn't an email she had sent, but one she had received from a junior accountant asking for clarification on an M&A expense report. Her reply was a brief, forwarded message to her executive assistant. The body of the email contained a single, scanned, handwritten note, a list of the 3 shell company names and their corresponding invoice amounts. At the bottom, a short typed instruction. Lisa, please expedite the processing of these. We need to accelerate the formal legalization of all preliminary M&A costs before the end of the quarter. Legalization, the word was a confession. I took a high-resolution screenshot, capturing the email headers, the timestamp, everything. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had the what, the how, and the who, but the evidence was fragile, ephemeral, a few keystrokes from a CFO with administrator privileges, and all of it, the logs, the emails, the invoices, could be scrubbed from the system forever. I couldn't risk it. I began the most dangerous part of my work. I started creating a mirror dataset on an encrypted, external solid-state drive. I began to copy everything, every transaction log, every invoice PDF, every email, every digital signature file. It was a slow, painstaking process. With each gigabyte that transferred, I felt a fresh wave of paranoia. I imagined the silent alarms I might be tripping in the IT department, the anomaly detection software that might flag such a large data transfer. I half expected the door to burst open, to see Celeste standing there with security. But nothing happened. The progress bar crept forward, a thin green line between discovery and destruction. When it was finished, I felt a profound sense of relief. I now had my own ledger, an invisible record of her crimes, and it was completely under my control. Every piece of evidence was meticulously cataloged. I created a master document, a timeline. Each finding was accompanied by a timestamp, the source IP address, the user account involved. I attached the screenshots, the raw log files, the PDFs. I was building a case, piece by irrefutable piece. The rage I felt was still there, a cold, dark star in the center of my being, but it was being channeled into the cool, relentless logic of the data. The numbers didn't have feelings. The numbers couldn't be gaslighted or intimidated. There was one loose thread. The access log showed activity, but I needed to know if the system itself had registered it as unusual. I needed an expert, someone who could look under the hood without asking why. I thought of Jonah Vale. He was one of our best network engineers, brilliant, perpetually overworked, and incurably curious. But he lacked any sense of corporate politics. He cared about how the system worked, not who it worked for. The next morning, I caught him by the coffee machine, holding his ever-present oversized mug. "Jonah, can I borrow your brain for a minute?" I asked, affecting a casual, slightly stressed tone. "I'm seeing some weird data latency on financial reports pulled from the executive floor. I think a background process might be eating up resources. Maybe some hidden security alerts that aren't being pushed to my dashboard. He took a sip of his coffee. Hidden alerts? From an exec terminal? Unlikely, but possible. Which terminal IP? I gave him the IP address for Celeste's office. Just the main desktop in the CFO's office. It's probably nothing, just a corrupted driver, but it's skewing my time series models. I'll take a look when I have a minute, he said. 2 hours later, a message popped up on my internal chat. It was from Jonah. You were right. Something's weird. It's not a corrupted driver. There's a ghost in the machine. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed back. What kind of ghost? A remote contractor account, user ID con75B, standard temp access profile, but it's not being used remotely. All of its recent login authentications are coming from inside our network, specifically from the CFO's office terminal IP you gave me. Someone is using a contractor account from inside the executive suite. That's a major security protocol violation. I've logged it. You think this is what was causing your latency? I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. A contractor account. A digital false flag. She had created another layer of misdirection. A scapegoat to blame if anyone ever got this far. That's probably it, I typed back, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. Thanks, Jonah. You're a lifesaver. I closed the chat window and leaned back in my chair. That was the final piece. The method, the motive, the cover-up. It was all there, laid out in a beautiful, terrifying mosaic of data. I looked at the encrypted drive on my desk. A small black rectangle of plastic and silicon. It contained a story, a complete and damning story of my stepmother. I finally understood. My testimony, the story of a garage, a fist, a whispered threat, was fallible. It was emotional. It could be dismissed as the bitter rantings of a jealous stepdaughter. But the data was absolute. My revenge would not be my words. My revenge would be the numbers, and numbers do not lie. With the digital evidence secure on my encrypted drive, the next phase of my plan began. It was no longer enough to know what Celeste had done. I needed to know what she would do. I needed to map the contours of her power within Northbridge dynamics, to understand the system she had built around herself. My first move was a calculated probe into the company's defenses. I decided to go to human resources. The senior HR business partner for the executive floor was a woman named Alina Rourke. Alina was a company woman down to her bones, a polished and impeccably professional individual whose primary function was to mitigate risk to Northbridge dynamics. She spoke in a carefully modulated voice, using a vocabulary rich with terms like leveraging synergy and optimizing outcomes. Her emails were masterpieces of non-committal corporate language. She was, in short, a gatekeeper. I knew that walking into her office with a complaint about the CFO would be like reporting a shark to the ocean, but my goal wasn't to find a resolution, it was to create a record. I sent Alina a carefully worded email requesting a confidential meeting to discuss a sensitive issue regarding workplace conduct and executive oversight. The language was deliberately vague, but contained enough buzzwords to be taken seriously. Her automated calendar assistant replied instantly, offering a slot 2 days later. The appointment, an impersonal block of blue in my calendar, felt like a baited hook. I had cast my line into the corporate waters to see what would bite. I didn't have to wait long. The following afternoon, I was walking back from the coffee station, my mug warming my hands, when I saw Celeste coming down the long, glass-walled corridor that connected the north and south wings of our floor. The hallway was a sterile tube of chrome and polished stone, empty at this time of day. Her purposeful stride slowed as she saw me. A perfectly calibrated smile, the one she reserved for public appearances, settled on her face. This was not a chance encounter. This was an interception. "Mara, dear," she began, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. She stopped a few feet from me. "Just the person I wanted to see." She tilted her head, her expression a careful performance of maternal concern. "How are you settling in with the Aurora Vex workload? You look a little tired." Then she took a half step closer, her voice dropping into a more intimate register. "Are you all right, honey?" She paused for a beat, as if catching herself in a moment of inappropriate familiarity, then corrected herself with surgical precision. "I mean, Mara." My entire body went rigid. The use of honey, the quick retraction, it was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, designed to infantilize me, to reframe our conflict as a petty family squabble between a concerned mother and a difficult child. My mind raced. I took a small, almost imperceptible step to my left, a minor adjustment that put me directly in the center of the ceiling-mounted security camera's field of view. The small black dome overhead was my silent, impartial witness. "I'm fine," I said, my voice flat, my eyes locked on hers. I held her gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. I allowed the silence to stretch, to become uncomfortable. I could feel the low-grade hum of the building's ventilation system, the distant ring of a telephone. Celeste's smile tightened, the skin around her eyes crinkling in a way that had nothing to do with humor. "Good," she said, her voice now losing its feigned warmth, becoming as hard and cold as the marble floor beneath our feet. "Because I would hate to think you were bringing any domestic disagreements into the office. This is a place of business. Family matters don't belong here." Her eyes, cold and blue, held no light, no warmth, nothing but a clear, unmistakable warning. She was telling me she knew about my meeting with HR. She was telling me to stop. The encounter lasted no more than half a minute, but it felt like an eternity. She gave a curt nod, then continued down the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking a sharp, receding rhythm. I stood perfectly still until she had turned the corner. I did not go back to my desk. I walked to the nearest stairwell, my heart pounding a frantic, trapped bird rhythm against my ribs. I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking, but my fingers moved with practiced precision. I opened my encrypted notes application and created a new entry. Title: Hallway Interaction C3. The C stood for camera. I noted the date and the exact time. Wednesday, 14:06. I transcribed her words verbatim, noting the calculated use of honey and the subsequent threat. I estimated the duration of the conversation at 21 seconds. It was another data point, another entry in the invisible ledger. The next morning, an email from Alina Rourke appeared in my inbox. Subject: Rescheduling our meeting. My eyes scanned the text, the blood in my veins turning to ice. "Hi, Mara," it began, with its offensively cheerful tone. "Unfortunately, I'm going to have to postpone our chat. We've had a number of urgent, high-priority items come up related to the M&A integration that require my immediate attention. My calendar is completely locked for the foreseeable future, at least until after the board's final budget vote. Let's look to reconnect sometime next month." It was signed with a meaningless, "All the best, Alina." The system had responded. Celeste had made a call, and the company had closed ranks around her. My HR request was not just postponed, it was buried. This was the proof I needed. It confirmed that the official channels were not just unhelpful, they were complicit, they were part of the facade. That evening, I implemented the next step of my plan. I had a blue 2-inch binder on my desk, filled with printouts of publicly available financial reports and market analyses related to the Aurora Vex deal. To a casual observer, it looked like a sensitive, high-level project file. It was my decoy. Before I left the office, I slipped a small, white plastic disc into the spine of the binder. It was an AirTag, registered to my personal account. It was my property, placed within my own work materials. It was perfectly, legally, mine. I placed the binder in the top drawer of my desk cabinet and locked it. It was a simple, old-fashioned lock, the kind that could be opened with a paperclip if you knew what you were doing. I was betting that Celeste, for all her digital sophistication, wouldn't be able to resist a simple, physical piece of bait. I went home. I made dinner. I tried to read a book, but my attention was entirely focused on my phone, on the Find My application open on the screen. The icon for the AirTag, which I had named Project Azure, showed its location precisely where it should be, the 40th floor of the Northbridge Dynamics building. For hours, it didn't move. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe I had misjudged her. Maybe she was smarter than this. At 9:47 p.m., my phone buzzed. A notification appeared on the screen. Project Azure has been detected near you, but I was at home, 10 miles away. I tapped the notification. The map refreshed. The small blue dot representing my AirTag was no longer in the main office area. It had moved. It was now pinging from the northeast corner of the building, the executive wing, the precise location of the CFO's office suite. My breath caught in my throat. She had taken the bait. She had broken into my desk and stolen the file. It was a clumsy, arrogant move, the act of a monarch who believes she is above suspicion. A moment later, my phone buzzed again. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but I knew who it was. Saya, the night receptionist, a young, observant woman with whom I had always been friendly. We had an unspoken understanding. The message was brief and to the point. Just saw Ms. Vancorp heading for the exec elevator. She was carrying a blue binder. Thought you should know. I typed back a single word. Thanks. I closed my phone and looked out my apartment window at the distant, indifferent lights of the city. I felt no surge of triumph, only a cold, quiet certainty. I had the digital track of the AirTag. I had a human witness. She had just committed a flagrant act of theft and intimidation, a desperate attempt to discover what I knew and seize control of the narrative. I had no intention of reporting the stolen file. I had no intention of confronting her about it at all. The blue binder contained nothing of value. Its only purpose was to make her act. I let her write the next chapter of her downfall herself. She was so focused on the family secrets in the garage, she couldn't see that the real trap was the one she was building for herself. One foolish, arrogant act at a time. In the cold, bright hallways of the office, the stolen binder was a misdirection, a piece of theater designed to make Celeste show her hand. The real evidence, the heart of the matter, was not in a file on my desk, but in a folder on my phone, and its power was about to be unlocked. The bruise on my jaw had begun its slow, chameleonic transformation, shifting from a violent purple to a sickly, mottled yellow-green. It was easier to hide now, but I looked at it every morning, a silent, daily recommitment to the course I had set. The pain had subsided, replaced by a cold, clear purpose. My next move took me away from the sterile confines of Northbridge Dynamics and back to the manicured streets of Alderwick. I walked down the block to the Hamiltons' house, but it wasn't them I was there to see. It was their next-door neighbor, Nora Finch, a widow in her late 70s who spent most of her days tending her prize-winning roses and observing the neighborhood's quiet dramas from her front porch. She was a kind woman, sharp as a tack, and an early adopter of every piece of home security technology on the market. She welcomed me into her immaculate, lavender-scented living room. After a few minutes of polite small talk about her roses and my father's health, I got to the point. "Nora," I began, my voice steady, "I have a strange request. I was wondering if I could see the footage from your doorbell camera from the night of my father's barbecue." Her eyebrows rose in curiosity. "Is everything all right, dear?" "Everything's fine," I lied smoothly. I think I might have dropped an earring in the driveway when I was leaving, and I wanted to see if I could spot where it might have rolled." It was a flimsy excuse, but Nora was too polite to question it further. "Of course," she said, tapping the screen of a large tablet on her coffee table. "Let's have a look. What time was this?" "Around 9:30, maybe a little later," I said. She scrolled back through the recorded events, her finger tapping on the screen. The camera's view was wide, capturing not only her own doorstep, but a clear, if slightly angled, view of my father's driveway and the closed doors of his garage. She found the log of motion alerts from that night. We watched as the last of the guests' cars pulled away. Then, at 9:43 p.m., 21:43 in the camera's timestamp, the video feed showed two figures walking toward the garage, me and Celeste. The image was grainy, captured under the dim glow of the porch light. But it was us. "There you are," Nora said. "Did you find your earring?" "Not yet," I said, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. "Can you play it?" She tapped the screen. We watched the silent, ghostly figures of Celeste and me disappear into the side door. A moment later, the main garage door began its slow, mechanical descent. It closed with a soft thud. Sealing the building, the driveway was empty. Nothing happened for a full minute. Then, the video's microphone, designed to pick up sounds at the doorstep, registered a sharp, percussive bang. It was muffled by the distance and the thick garage door, but it was unmistakable. Nora frowned. "What on earth was that? Sounded like a gunshot." "I think something fell," I said, keeping my voice calm. I took out my phone and navigated to the June incidents folder. I opened the photo I had taken in the bathroom mirror that night. "This is going to seem strange," I said, "but can you pause the video right before the garage door closes?" She obliged, her curiosity now clearly piqued. I held my phone up to the tablet's screen. The angle of the shot was almost perfect. In the doorbell video, the vertical seams of the garage door panels were clearly visible. In my photo, taken from inside, the same seams were visible behind me, reflected in the bathroom mirror. I adjusted my phone until the lines on my screen aligned perfectly with the lines on hers. The bruise on my cheek in the photo was located in the exact quadrant of the garage where we had been standing. We had created a perfect, chilling triangulation of time, place, and injury. Nora Finch looked from my phone to the tablet, her eyes widening as she made the connection. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning horror. She didn't ask what had happened. She was a woman who understood the art of not asking questions that didn't need to be asked. "There was another sound, a few seconds after that bang," she said, her voice now a low, conspiratorial whisper. She rewound the video and turned up the volume. We heard the muffled thud again, and then, a few seconds later, a sharp, metallic clatter, like a stack of paint cans being knocked over. It was the sound of me falling against the storage shelves. "Nora," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "I need a copy of that video file, the entire clip, from the moment we walked to the garage until after the last sound." She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. "I'll export it for you right now, dear." The next day, I was not at Northbridge Dynamics. I was in the quiet, wood-paneled office of a discreet downtown lawyer who specialized in corporate litigation. I didn't tell him the whole story. I didn't need to. I told him I had time-sensitive digital evidence related to a potential corporate malfeasance case, and I needed to establish an irrefutable chain of custody. He understood immediately. I handed him a USB drive containing the doorbell video file and the photos of my bruise. He watched as his paralegal copied the files onto a secure, air-gapped server. Then, he initiated a program that generated a SHA-256 hash for each file, a long, unique alphanumeric string that acted as a digital fingerprint. Any change to the file, no matter how small, would result in a completely different hash. He printed the hash codes, attached them to a formal, notarized letter describing the evidence, and sealed the package. A digital copy, encrypted, was sent to a secure third-party escrow service. My evidence was now legally unimpeachable. It was no longer just a collection of files. It was a sealed, time-stamped fact. That evening, I continued to build my case. I went back through my email archives. I found the message Celeste had sent me in the early hours of the morning after the barbecue. It had arrived at 12:12 a.m. The subject line was, "Tonight." The message itself was short and chillingly manipulative. "I know you're upset," it read, "but you need to think about your father. Don't ruin things with him over a misunderstanding. Let Mother handle it." The use of Mother was a poisoned dart, a claim to a role she had never earned and only ever used as a weapon. I saved the email, complete with its full, unabridged headers showing its origin and delivery path, and added it to my growing collection. With this final piece, I began to weave everything together. I created a new document, a master timeline, I titled it, Home to Office, A Chronology of Coercive Control. It began with the barbecue photo and the 21:43 timestamp on Nora Finch's video. It included the 12:12 a.m. email. It then jumped to the office, the 10:12 a.m. veiled threat in the Sable Room, the 14:06 hallway intimidation under camera C3, the subsequent cancellation of my HR meeting. It detailed the theft of the blue binder, complete with the AirTag's location data and Saya's text message. Each entry was a cold, hard data point. Each was a step on a deliberate path of escalation. It was a narrative that connected the physical violence in the garage to the psychological intimidation and abuse of power in the workplace. But I needed to know how to deploy it. I couldn't just email it to the board. I needed a formal channel, one that Celeste couldn't shut down. I remembered the company's mandatory annual ethics training. There was a section on the corporate whistleblower policy, which included a link to an anonymous, third-party ethics and compliance hotline. I logged on from a private browser at home. A chat window popped up. I described a hypothetical situation: an employee with evidence of both financial misconduct and a pattern of harassment and intimidation from a senior executive, an executive with whom they also had a complex personal relationship. The anonymous agent on the other end of the chat was methodical. They explained that this was a complex situation that fell under two distinct categories: a financial ethics violation and a workplace safety issue. They gave me the crucial piece of advice I'd been searching for. They told me about the dual report protocol. It was a mechanism for situations exactly like this, where corporate and personal malfeasance were intertwined. I would file two identical reports simultaneously. One would go directly to the independent members of the Board of Directors Audit Committee, bypassing the internal chain of command entirely. The second, they advised, should be filed with the appropriate external authorities. The two reports would act as a fail-safe for each other. If the company tried to bury the internal report, the external one would still proceed. It was the perfect weapon. There was one last detail, one final, beautiful, technical nail for the coffin. I messaged Jonah Vale the next day. Quick question, I wrote. That ghost contractor account, Con75B, can you tell what kind of network connection it was using? Was it on the secure corporate LAN or something else? It took him less than 5 minutes to reply. Something else. And you're not going to believe this. It was authenticated through the public guest Wi-Fi. My breath caught. It was the mistake of a true amateur, a fatal flaw born of pure arrogance. To avoid creating a record of her own machine's MAC address on the secure, heavily monitored corporate network. Celeste had logged into the contractor account using the building's public guest Wi-Fi from her office. She thought she was being clever, creating another layer of separation. But what she had actually done was prove that someone had to be physically present in her office, using a separate, less secure network to perform the fraudulent transactions. It was the digital equivalent of wearing a disguise but leaving your own wallet at the scene of the crime. I thanked Jonah and closed the chat. I had everything: the physical evidence, the digital trail, the witnesses, the corporate procedure, and the final, damning technical error. The picture was complete. I opened my calendar. I navigated to the contact page for the audit committee's independent chairman. I drafted a short, formal email. Subject: request for urgent meeting. Fiduciary and ethical concerns. In the body, I requested a 30-minute presentation slot at their next scheduled meeting to discuss time-sensitive findings from a data integrity review. An automated reply came back within seconds. The next meeting of the audit committee was scheduled for the following week. Thursday, 10:00 a.m., I clicked accept. The appointment appeared in my calendar. A solid, unmovable block of time. The date was set. The countdown had begun. The boardroom on the executive floor was a place designed to absorb sound and project power. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany. The carpet was a thick, charcoal gray, and the air itself seemed heavy, conditioned to a precise, cool temperature. A long, polished granite table reflected the grim faces of the three people who would decide Celeste's fate. They were the independent members of the Northbridge Dynamics Audit Committee. At the head sat Marcus Thorne, the chairman, a retired industrialist with a face like carved granite and eyes that had seen 1,000 desperate pitches. To his right was Evelyn Reed, a former tech CEO from Silicon Valley, her sharp, analytical gaze missing nothing. To his left, George Samuel, a veteran of international finance, whose defining characteristic was an almost pathological aversion to risk. They were the company's ultimate arbiters, beholden to no one but the shareholders. Completing the assembly were Harlan Mott, our interim CEO, looking deeply uncomfortable, and Kaylin Shaw, the company's general counsel, her face a mask of professional neutrality. And then there was Celeste. She sat 2 chairs down from me, radiating an aura of untouchable confidence, her posture perfect, a leather-bound portfolio placed squarely before her. She believed this was a formality, a minor annoyance to be swatted away. I sat at the far end of the table, my laptop open, its screen mirrored on the massive display at the front of the room. My own reflection was a pale, small shape in the polished table, a ghost at the feast. I had slept for 3 hours the night before, not from anxiety, but from a state of pure, crystalline focus. The time for emotion was over. Today was for the data. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," I began, my voice even and clear, betraying none of the turmoil that had led me to this room. "My name is Mara Quinn, Head of Data Analytics. The purpose of this presentation is to bring to the committee's attention certain financial and procedural anomalies discovered during a routine data integrity review related to the Aurora Vex acquisition." I clicked to my first slide. It was a simple, brutal bar chart. It showed the allocated consulting and advisory fees for the 4 quarters preceding the acquisition announcement, a steady, predictable line. Then, in the quarter of the announcement, the bar shot up by nearly 500%. A collective stillness settled over the room. Even the almost imperceptible tap of George Samuel's pen went silent. "As you can see," I continued, my voice the calmest thing in the room, "there was a significant, and as yet unexplained, spike in expenditure. My team and I drilled down into these costs to understand the drivers." My next click brought up a new slide. It was a network graph, a spiderweb of connections. On one side were 3 boxes labeled Everline Solutions, Wexel Group, and Carberry Associates. Lines flowed from them, representing payments of $150,000 each. These lines did not lead to a project ledger or a cost center. They converged on a single, gray, unlabeled box at the center of the screen. "These 3 entities," I explained, "were onboarded as new vendors in the last fiscal year. They have no prior history with Northbridge, no public-facing presence, and their registered addresses are commercial mail drops. Over a period of 2 weeks, they were paid a total of $450,000. The funds, as far as our internal systems can trace them, terminate at this point." I used the laser pointer to circle the gray box. A single, unidentified holding company. Evelyn Reed leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "Unidentified? How is that possible?" "That is the question that prompted this review," I replied. Moving to the next slide, it displayed a screenshot of the system logs. Highlighted in yellow were the digital authorization signatures for the payments, the timestamps, and the user credentials. The payments were approved via a legitimate CFO subaccount with delegated authority. The timestamps, however, are noteworthy. The approvals were executed at 11:17 p.m. on a Saturday and a Sunday. Furthermore, our network forensics indicate the user was not logged into the secure corporate network, but rather the public guest Wi-Fi, using a temporary contractor account, CON 75B, from a device located physically within the CFO's office suite. A sharp intake of breath, all eyes in the room, which had been darting between me and the screen, now swiveled to fixate on one person, Celeste. Her composure finally cracked. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "This is a complete fabrication. Ms. Quinn has clearly misinterpreted, or more likely, manipulated the source data. The integrity of our financial reporting is beyond reproach. I demand to know where this so-called forensic data came from. It was the exact response I had anticipated. Her first move was to attack the evidence, to sow doubt, to claim the numbers were lies. I did not look at her. I did not engage. I kept my eyes on Marcus Thorne and pressed the button on my remote. A new slide appeared. It was a dry technical display, showing 2 long alphanumeric strings. It was titled SHA256 Checksum Verification. I anticipated this concern, I said calmly, which is why, yesterday morning, before this meeting was even formally on the calendar, I asked a senior network engineer, Jonah Vale, to perform a checksum hash on the raw, immutable server logs from the period in question. This acts as a digital fingerprint. The top string is the fingerprint of the data as it existed on the server at 7:02 a.m. yesterday. The bottom string is the fingerprint of the data I am presenting today. As you can see, they are identical. The data has not been altered. I paused for a beat. Mr. Vale is on standby to join this meeting via video call to confirm his independent verification, should the committee require it. Checkmate. I had not only presented the evidence, I had presented proof of the evidence's own integrity. Celeste's face, for the first time since I had known her, was a mask of stunned silence. The charge of data manipulation had been neutralized before it could even take root. I moved to my final slide. It contained only a few lines of text under the heading, Recommended Next Steps. Given the nature of these findings, I said, addressing the committee directly, I recommend the immediate engagement of an independent, third-party forensic accounting firm to conduct a full audit of all M&A-related expenditures, and as a precautionary measure, I recommend a temporary suspension of the implicated user accounts and their associated signing authorities pending the outcome of that investigation. I had not named her. I didn't have to. The data had done that for me. The room was silent for a long moment. Marcus Thorne looked at the general counsel, Ms. Shaw. Kaylin Shaw, who had been observing the entire exchange without a flicker of emotion, spoke for the first time. Her voice was cool and precise. From a legal and risk management perspective, the company must act on these allegations immediately to protect its fiduciary interests. The recommendation for an independent audit is sound. Furthermore, pending that review, I believe a temporary suspension of the CFO's financial approval and system administration privileges is a necessary and prudent step to ensure the integrity of the investigation. The words landed like hammer blows. Celeste's face went white. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Harlan Mott raised a hand. His face was grim. He was a man watching a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. His sole focus, suddenly be threatened by a fire in his own house. I suggest we take a 20-minute recess, he said, his voice strained. No one moved. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a crushing weight. No one wanted a recess. Everyone knew that the next words spoken in this room would be irreversible. Thorne, Reed, and Samuel exchanged a long, meaningful look. The unspoken decision was made. I reached forward and closed my laptop. The screen went dark. The quiet click of the lid shutting was the only sound in the tomb-like silence of the room. My hand, as it rested on the cool metal casing, was perfectly steady. There was no adrenaline, no fear, only the quiet hum of a plan perfectly executed. I had spent every night for the past week rehearsing this moment in my mind, playing out every move, every counter-move, every line of dialogue. I had trained for this moment. I was ready. Harlan Mott's suggestion of a recess hung in the air, an unaccepted offer of a ceasefire in a battle that had already been decided. No one moved. Marcus Thorne, the chairman, simply looked at Celeste, his expression a flat, unreadable mask, and waited. The power in the room had shifted, flowing away from the head of the table and consolidating at my end, where the closed laptop sat like a dormant volcano. Celeste, seeing the professional ground crumble beneath her, made a final, desperate pivot. She abandoned the language of finance and reached for the weapons of the family. Her posture softened. her shoulders slumping in a calculated performance of wounded matriarchy. She let out a long theatrical sigh, a sound of profound and misplaced sorrow. She turned her chair slightly, breaking the sterile formation of the meeting, and addressed me directly. Her voice now filled with a quavering, false sincerity. "Mara," she said, the name a soft, pleading whisper. "We're family. Whatever issues you think we have, think of your father. You know your father's heart condition. The stress of something like this, it could be devastating." The air in the room grew thick, charged with a new and deeply uncomfortable energy. She was attempting to take the entire proceeding hostage. Using my father's health as a human shield, she was transforming a corporate inquisition into a private, domestic drama, casting herself as the concerned wife and me as the reckless, ungrateful daughter. The 3 committee members shifted in their seats, their faces hardening. This was not the kind of risk they were paid to manage. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her emotional appeal. I let her words hang in the silence for a long moment. Then I answered, my voice so quiet, it was almost a whisper. Yet it cut through the room like a shard of glass. "There is no Mara here," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "There is only Ms. Quinn, the head of data analytics, and you are Ms. Vancorp, the chief financial officer. Family is not a line item on this agenda." The effect was instantaneous. It was as if I had thrown a switch, plunging the room into a deep freeze. Celeste recoiled, as if struck. Evelyn Reed's pen, which had been poised over her notepad, was now perfectly still. Harlan Mott closed his eyes for a brief, pained moment. I had refused to play her game. I had taken her personal appeal and rendered it inadmissible. Cornered. Her attempt at manipulation shattered. She lunged with her final, ugliest weapon, character assassination. The mask of concern vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure venom. Her voice rose, becoming shrill, accusatory. "You see?" she spat, gesturing at me with a trembling hand, now playing to the committee as her audience. "You see what this is? This has nothing to do with consulting fees or access logs. This is a personal vendetta. This is a sad, pathetic act of emotional revenge from a jealous girl who could never accept her father's new wife. She has been poisoning him against me from the day I moved in. And now she brings her childish fantasies into the boardroom to ruin my career, because she can't stand to see her father happy." It was a classic, desperate defense. If you can't refute the evidence, attack the messenger. She was trying to paint me as an unreliable narrator, a woman scorned, driven by hysteria rather than facts. For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed George Samuel's face. It was the opening she was looking for. I did not respond to her accusations. I did not defend my motives. I simply reached forward and opened my laptop again. The screen came to life, and with a single click, a new image filled the large display at the front of the room. The emotional, chaotic noise of her accusations died in an instant, replaced by a profound, tomb-like silence. The slide was not a chart or a graph. It was a photograph, a high-resolution, clinical close-up of my face, taken in the unforgiving light of a bathroom. A vicious, ugly bruise bloomed across my jaw and cheek, a violent constellation of purple, blue, and sickly green. In the background, reflected in the mirror behind me, the distinct vertical seams of a garage door were visible. At the bottom of the slide, in stark white text, was a single line of data. Source, N, Finch Doorbell Cam, Event Log, 2143, Saturday, June 8th. The carefully constructed artifice of the boardroom, the entire pretense of civilized corporate procedure, shattered. Evelyn Reed let out a small, sharp gasp. Marcus Thorne's granite face seemed to pale, his eyes fixed on the screen in horror. This was no longer about money, it was about something far uglier, something that had breached the pristine walls of their corporation. It was Kaylin Shaw, the general counsel, who broke the spell. Her face was as impassive as ever, but her eyes were alert, her mind already calculating the cascading legal implications. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "This constitutes new evidence of a potentially criminal nature. We need to secure it immediately. Ms. Quinn, I need a copy of that image file and the source video it refers to now." "Of course," I said. I opened my email client, my fingers moving calmly over the keyboard. I attached 2 files. The first was the photo, the second was another exhibit, one I had held in reserve. It was a screenshot of Celeste's email, sent at 12:12 a.m., the night of the barbecue. The words, "Don't ruin things with him," and "Let Mother handle it," were highlighted in yellow. I included the full, unredacted email headers, a digital fingerprint proving its origin and path. I addressed the email to Kaylin Shaw and the 3 members of the committee, and pressed send. A series of soft chimes echoed around the table as the email landed in their inboxes. That was when Celeste finally broke, the last vestiges of her control. Her poise, her entire carefully constructed persona, disintegrated. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Lies! It's all lies!" she shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. "She faked it! It's makeup! It's a childish fabrication from a lying, manipulative little brat!" Her face was contorted. Her carefully applied mask of civility melted away to reveal the raw, ugly rage beneath. She was no longer a CFO. She was just a cornered animal, spitting and clawing. Before anyone else could react, Harlan Mott spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. He looked directly at Celeste, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Ms. Vancorp," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you are the chief financial officer of a publicly traded company. I suggest you start acting like one." The words hung in the air, a final, brutal dismissal of her and everything she had just tried to do. Celeste seemed to shrink, the fight draining out of her. She sank back into her chair, her face ashen, her breathing ragged. Marcus Thorne cleared his throat. He looked at Evelyn Reed, then at George Samuel. A silent, instantaneous consensus was reached. The committee will now vote on the motion to immediately and indefinitely suspend Ms. Vancorp from all duties as Chief Financial Officer, pending the results of a full, independent forensic investigation into both the financial and ethical matters raised here today. He didn't need to call for a show of hands. "Aye," said Reed, her voice firm. "Aye," said Samuel, his doubt completely erased. "The motion carries," Thorne declared, his voice flat. "Ms. Vancorp, you will be escorted from the building. Your access to all company systems is terminated, effective immediately." I didn't look at her. I didn't want to see the expression on her face. I didn't feel triumph, or vindication, or even relief. I just felt a profound, hollow emptiness. My gaze drifted to the large, plate-glass window that formed one wall of the boardroom. Reflected in its surface was the chrome Northbridge Dynamics logo from the building across the plaza. From this angle, due to a slight imperfection in the glass, the reflection of the proud, solid logo appeared to have a thin, jagged crack running right through its center. It was broken, and I was the one who had broken it. The 5 hours between the audit committee meeting and the emergency session of the full board of directors were the longest of my life. I did not return to my desk. I was sequestered in a small, empty office on the legal floor, a fishbowl with a view of the afternoon sky. I was a witness, a complainant, and the instrument of a corporate detonation, and the company's lawyers needed to ensure I was kept sterile, away from the contamination of office gossip or worse, another confrontation with Celeste. At precisely 5 p.m., I was escorted back to the main boardroom. The atmosphere had changed. The tense, charged silence of the morning had been replaced by the cold, grim formality of a state funeral. The full board was present. A dozen men and women in dark suits seated around the long granite table. At the head sat Marcus Thorne, his face set in stone. The company's legal team was there, but they were now flanked by 2 new faces from Stratton and Croft, a notoriously ruthless external law firm, and beside them sat a team of 3 people from a forensic accounting firm, their laptops already open, their expressions radiating a profound, almost joyful professional pessimism. Celeste was there, seated in a chair set slightly back from the main table, next to her own lawyer. She was no longer a participant. She was the subject of the proceedings. Her face was a pale, powdered mask of composure, but the illusion was shattered by the slight, uncontrollable tremor in her hands. The confidence was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive stillness. There were no pleasantries. Marcus Thorne called the meeting to order with a single rap of his knuckles on the table. This emergency session has been called to address a matter of extreme urgency and gravity, he announced, his voice a low rumble. This morning, the audit committee was presented with evidence of significant financial misconduct at the executive level. We engaged an external firm to conduct a preliminary forensic analysis. Mr. Davies, you have the floor. One of the forensic accountants, a man with the weary, methodical air of an undertaker, stood up. He nodded curtly to the board. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, given the limited time, our analysis is necessarily preliminary, but our findings are unambiguous. The large screen at the front of the room, which had earlier displayed my photograph, now showed a stark, clinical flowchart. It was a more detailed, more authoritative version of the one I had created. We have confirmed the existence of the 3 shell corporations, Everline, Wexel, and Carberry, Davies said, his voice a dry monotone. We have confirmed the 3 payments of $150,000 each. We have traced the flow of those funds. He clicked a button. The lines on the flowchart extended, converging, as mine had, on a single box, but this time, the box was not gray and unlabeled. The funds were consolidated and transferred into a single entity, Davies continued. A private family trust, incorporated 18 months ago. The name of that trust is the Alderwick Heritage Trust. A low murmur rippled through the room. Several of the board members who had known my father for years shifted uncomfortably. Alderwick was the name of our town. It was a name synonymous with my family. Davies clicked again. A new slide appeared, showing a scanned document. The trust's articles of incorporation. The key roles were highlighted in yellow. The sole beneficiary of the Alderwick Heritage Trust, he announced, letting the words land with maximum impact, is Mr. Daniel Quinn. The room fell into a shocked, absolute silence. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was a detail I had not uncovered, a layer of deception so profound, so monstrous, that I had never even considered it. I looked at Celeste. She was staring at the table, her mask of composure finally beginning to crack at the edges. The primary trustee, Davies concluded, his voice devoid of any emotion, with sole unilateral control over all assets and disbursements, is Ms. Celeste Vancorp. This was the twist, the final, venomous turn of the knife. It wasn't just theft. It was a masterpiece of psychological entrapment. She hadn't stolen the money for a lavish lifestyle. She had stolen it to gain absolute control. She had laundered corporate funds through a trust in my father's name, making him the beneficiary of her crime without his knowledge. She had entangled his personal finances, his legacy, with her own fraud. If she were ever discovered, any attempt to prosecute her would inevitably drag my father, the founder, the patriarch, into the mud with her. She had made him her ultimate shield, leveraging his reputation and his fragile health against the very company he had built. Mr. Stratton, the senior partner from the external law firm, rose to his feet. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he said, his voice resonating with gravitas, "what we have here is a clear and egregious breach of fiduciary duty, likely constituting multiple felonies, including wire fraud and embezzlement. Ms. Vancorp's contract contains a standard clawback provision, which allows the company to reclaim all bonuses and incentive compensation paid out during the period in which the fraudulent activity occurred. We will, of course, be pursuing that to the fullest extent. Furthermore, The company has a legal and ethical obligation to report these findings to the relevant authorities, including the District Attorney's Office and the SEC. The net was closing. Every word was another steel strand being pulled tight. It was my turn to deliver the final blow. I cleared my throat, and all eyes turned to me. "Mr. Chairman," I said, my voice steady, "in light of these developments, and in accordance with the company's whistleblower policy, I have, within the last hour, submitted a formal dual report." I paused, letting them process the term. "The first part of that report, detailing the financial malfeasance, has been submitted electronically to this board and the General Counsel. The second part," I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room before finally landing, for a brief, cold moment, on Celeste, "details a pattern of workplace intimidation, abuse of authority, and physical assault. That report, along with the corroborating evidence presented to the Audit Committee this morning, has been formally filed with the Alderwick Police Department. If the financial revelations had been a shock, this was an earthquake. The matter was no longer just a corporate problem to be managed. It was a public record, a police file. It was beyond their control." Marcus Thorne looked at Celeste, his face a mask of cold fury. There would be no more discussion, no more debate. The time for that was long past. "Celeste," he said, and the use of her first name was more damning than any insult. "The board requires your immediate and unconditional resignation." Her lawyer leaned over and whispered in her ear. She simply nodded. A slow, jerky movement. A single sheet of paper and a pen were placed in front of her. She signed it without reading it. Her signature, usually a confident, flamboyant script, was a thin, spidery scrawl. As she put the pen down, my phone, which I had placed on silent in my pocket, began to vibrate. I didn't have to look. I knew who it was. The screen would show a picture of my father, smiling on a boat. The vibration stopped, then started again. A second call. He must have seen the news alerts, or perhaps someone from the company had called him. He was reaching out, confused, desperate. I pressed my hand against my pocket, stilling the vibration. A small, silent act of refusal. I would not answer, not now, maybe not ever. Thorne nodded to the head of corporate security, who had been waiting discreetly by the door. The man stepped forward. "Ms. Vancorp, if you'll come with me." She stood up, her movements stiff, robotic. She did not look at anyone, as she was escorted from the room, a lifetime of power and prestige evaporating with each step. Harlan Mott walked over to me, the pragmatist, the crisis manager. "Mara," he said, his voice low. "That was remarkable. We're going to have a mess to clean up, a big one. I'm putting together a data integrity task force to lead the internal investigation, to work with the auditors. I want you to head it up, effective immediately." It was a battlefield promotion, an offer of power in the wreckage she had created. But I didn't want power. I wanted justice. I wanted it to be over. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "Mr. Mott, my only priority right now is to ensure a complete, transparent, and orderly handover of all my findings to the independent investigators. Once that process is complete and the integrity of the data is secure, we can discuss what comes next." He nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He understood. This wasn't about ambition. The heavy mahogany door of the boardroom clicked shut, sealing the room. The sound of Celeste's heels, the sharp, confident rhythm that had for years announced her power, was gone. In its place, there was only a faint, fading echo in the hallway. And then, silence. The morning after felt like the quietest day of my life. The world had not stopped turning, but the frantic, high-frequency hum that had been my constant companion for weeks had finally ceased. I stood in my bathroom, the same one where I had documented the initial injury, and stared at my reflection. The overhead fluorescent light was, as always, merciless. It stripped away all softness, revealing the truth of things. The bruise on my jaw was no longer a violent splash of purple, but a faded, yellowish stain, the ugly ghost of a past storm. It was healing. I wondered how long it would take for the parts of me that no one could see to do the same. My movements were slow, deliberate. I took a soft gel pack from the freezer and wrapped it in a thin towel, a ritual I had performed every morning. I pressed it against my cheek, not because it still ached, but because the cold was a grounding sensation. The sharp chill on my skin was a clear, unambiguous signal in a world that had become a blur of subtext and lies. My skin was cold. My mind felt strangely warm and lucid, and for the first time in a very long time, my heart beat with a slow, steady, even rhythm. The war was over. I was simply surveying the field. My phone lay on the counter, a black rectangle of dormant chaos. I had 17 missed calls from my father, and one new voicemail, left at dawn. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. His voice, usually so full of confident bluster, was a wreck. It was thin, broken, punctuated by ragged breaths. "Mara, honey, it's Dad. I saw the news. The lawyers. Celeste." He choked on her name. "God, Mara. I didn't know. I never. About what she said you were just difficult. Your mother. She would have." His voice dissolved into a choked, unintelligible sound, a man drowning in a sea of revelations he could not comprehend. The message ended with a soft click. I listened to it once. I did not feel anger, or pity, or even sadness. I felt a profound, desolate distance. He had lived in the house, slept in the same bed, and had seen nothing because he had not wanted to see. His ignorance was a choice, a carefully constructed fortress I could no longer afford to live inside. I deleted the message. Then, I opened a new text. My thumbs moved with a calm precision. The message was 5 words long. "I am safe. The lawyers will handle the rest." I sent it. It was not an invitation to a conversation. It was a statement of fact, a boundary, a wall. Later that morning, I met with my personal lawyer, the same discreet woman who had helped me notarize my evidence. I handed her the master encrypted drive, the one I had copied in the dead of night at the office. It contained everything: the financial data, the videos, the photos, the emails, the hallway confrontation notes, the AirTag logs, Saya's text. I was offloading the burden, handing the story over to the cold, impersonal machinery of the law. "This is the primary evidence," I told her. "My legal team at Northbridge has a copy, as do the independent auditors. I kept one final copy for myself, on a new drive, protected by a private encryption key whose password existed only in my mind. A final insurance policy. A data analyst never gives up her source code." Back at the office, the atmosphere was strange, subdued. People avoided my gaze, but the way they avoided it was different. It wasn't the shunning of a pariah. It was the awkward deference shown to the survivor of a catastrophe. No one knew what to say, so they said nothing. The silence was a form of respect. A chat notification popped up on my screen. It was from Jonah Vale. The message contained no words, just a single, yellow emoji, a shield, a simple, perfect symbol of solidarity. He knew he had been a pawn in my game, but he also knew which side had been playing for the truth. He had seen the data. He knew. I sent back a simple thumbs up. The shield was enough. A little while later, Saya from reception walked past my desk. She placed a steaming paper cup of coffee beside my keyboard. It was a dark roast, the kind I always drank. She met my eyes for a fleeting second, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then walked away without a word. The coffee was an anchor, a small, warm gesture of humanity in the cold, silent aftermath. An hour later, a company-wide email landed in my inbox. The sender was Harlan Mott. The subject line read, "Reaffirming our commitment to a safe and ethical workplace." It was a masterpiece of corporate damage control, filled with soaring rhetoric about transparency, integrity, and the importance of our shared values. It mentioned the immediate departure of a senior executive and the launch of a full, independent investigation. It announced new, streamlined procedures for anonymous ethical reporting and a zero-tolerance policy for workplace harassment. I read the carefully crafted paragraphs with a detached sense of irony. It was a memo written in blood, my blood, but it was a start. It was a tangible change in the architecture of the company. It was a new rule, written because I had refused to break. Then, my phone rang. The caller ID was for Alina Rourke from Human Resources. A week ago, she had canceled my meeting to protect her boss. Now, her boss was gone, and she was calling me. I let it ring 4 times, then answered. "Mara," she began, her voice strained with an unfamiliar tone of deference. I just wanted to reach out. On behalf of the company, I want to formally apologize for the delay in addressing your concerns. We are here to support you in any way we can." The offer hung in the air, a hollow gesture after the fact. Support. I didn't need their support now. But there was one thing, a small, symbolic change that I suddenly wanted with a fierce, burning clarity. "Thank you, Alina," I said, my voice even. "I don't need anything, but I would like to request a desk change." "Of course," she said, her relief palpable. "Anything? A corner office? A larger workstation?" "No," I said. "I'd like the empty desk by the north-facing window in the open plan area. I want a seat with a view." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The one by the window," she repeated, as if trying to understand a complex request. "Consider it done." That evening, I drove home as a light. Steady rain began to fall on Alderwick. The streets glistened under the streetlights, the air smelling clean and new. In my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked to the large window in my living room that looked out over the town. The rain whispered against the glass, a soft, percussive rhythm. I thought of the night of the barbecue, the suffocating smell of charcoal smoke, honeyed sauce, and Celeste's cloying perfume. It felt like a lifetime ago, a scene from someone else's life. I unlocked the window and pushed it open. A cool, damp breeze flowed into the room, carrying the rich, earthy scent of wet pavement and damp soil, the smell of the rain. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the clean, wet air fill my lungs. It was the smell of something being washed away. It was a week later when I walked back through the main entrance of the Northbridge Dynamics building. The morning light, filtered through the lobby's towering glass walls, seemed less harsh than before. The polished concrete floors less of a cold, unforgiving mirror. The building hadn't changed, but I had. As I approached the security turnstiles, the guard on duty, a man I'd nodded to 1,000 times, met my eyes. He didn't smile, but his expression was one of quiet, professional respect. He held up a small plastic card. "Ms. Quinn," he said, his voice neutral. "They sent this down for you." He took the temporary visitor's pass I'd been using for the past several days and handed me the new card. It was a permanent employee ID with full access credentials. My name was printed in sharp, black letters under a new, unsmiling photograph. The exchange was brief, mundane, yet it felt like a formal transfer of power. I was no longer a visitor in the wreckage of the old regime. I was a permanent resident of whatever came next. I swiped the card, and the turnstile gate slid open with a soft, permissive whoosh. As I walked into the atrium, my eyes were drawn to the massive LED screen that usually displayed upbeat corporate news and stock market tickers. Today, it showed a single, static message, the text stark white against a navy blue background. It read, "CFO resignation, interim controls enacted. A full review of internal financial protocols is underway to ensure the continued integrity of our operations." An entire career, a reign of terror, a life's ambition, all erased and condensed into a single, sterile, 13-word sentence. Celeste Vancorp was no longer a person. She was a past event, a procedural anomaly that had been addressed. The corporate machine had absorbed the shock, purged the foreign body, and recalibrated itself with ruthless efficiency. Her name was already gone, scrubbed from the digital walls as if it had never been there at all. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. The office was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet from the one I had worked in before. The tension was gone. The air felt lighter, less compressed. I walked down the long corridor toward the executive wing, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I had a new desk now, the one by the window, but I found myself pausing, almost involuntarily, outside the corner office, her office. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. The blinds on the floor-to-ceiling windows, once kept perpetually shut, were now wide open, flooding the room with morning light. I pushed the door open a few more inches and looked inside. The room was empty, completely, utterly empty. Her degrees were gone from the walls. The personal photos vanished from the credenza. The massive oak desk that had been her throne was gone. All that remained was a faint, rectangular impression in the deep pile carpet where the desk had once stood, a pale ghost of its former weight and authority. The room was just a room now, a silent, hollow space, waiting for a new occupant, its memory already fading. I stared at the empty space for a long time, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow echo. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A sudden, jarring intrusion. I pulled it out. A text message from my father. "I'm on my way to you. We need to talk." My thumb hovered over the screen. I thought of his broken voice on the voicemail. The years of willful blindness. The comfortable cage of denial he had built for himself. I thought of the man who had let a monster into his house, into his company, into my life. The conversation he wanted was one I was not ready to have. Maybe I never would be. I typed back a short, simple reply, each letter a small, sharp tap against the glass. "Another time, Dad." I sent the message and put the phone back in my pocket without waiting for a response. I turned away from the empty office and walked towards the elevators. As I waited, I caught my reflection in the polished chrome of the doors. It was a clearer, sharper image than the one in the lobby's logo. I saw a woman in a simple, dark dress. I looked at her face, at the line of her jaw. The last of the yellowing bruise had finally faded to nothing. My skin was clear. I looked at my collar, at the crisp white shirt I wore underneath the dress. It was clean, unstained. There was no mark, no trace of the violence that had set everything in motion. The evidence was gone from my body, but the verdict was written into the history of the company. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors sliding open, I stepped inside. The doors closed, and my reflection vanished. I pressed the button for my new floor, the data analytics department. As the elevator began its smooth descent, I kept my eyes fixed on the doors in front of me. I did not look back. When I stepped out onto the street level, the city felt different. The rain had stopped. The morning sun was breaking through the clouds, and the wet pavement steamed, a soft gray mist rising from the asphalt. A few feet away, the large, stainless steel Northbridge Dynamics sign that adorned the front of the building was still beaded with moisture, each drop of water catching the light like a tiny, fractured lens. The air smelled of rain and exhaust fumes, the normal, anonymous scent of the city going about its business. I paused on the sidewalk, amidst the flow of anonymous pedestrians, and took a deep, shuddering breath. I reached into my pocket and my fingers closed around a small, smooth piece of plastic. It was the empty USB drive, the one I had kept as my final, encrypted copy. It was blank now. I had wiped it clean that morning. The data had been delivered. The story had been told. The evidence was in the hands of the people who would see it through to its conclusion. There was nothing left to save, nothing left to back up. Its purpose was fulfilled. It was just an empty vessel. I stepped off the curb to cross the street. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a passing bus, the murmur of 100 conversations washing over me. The noise was a comfort, a great, anonymous roar that could swallow anything. As I walked, My hand drifted up, my fingers coming to rest for a moment on my collarbone, on the delicate, fragile bone just beneath the skin. I felt the steady, reassuring beat of my own pulse. It was a quiet affirmation. I was still here. The noise of the city swelled, a symphony of concrete and steel, and in its rising crescendo, it finally, mercifully, drowned out the last, fading echo of a whisper from a dark garage, the one that had started it all. "Don't tell Dad." I hadn't. I let the numbers speak for me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I'd love to know your thoughts. So please comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from. Let's connect and share our ideas. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you really want to support the story, hit that hype button to help it get heard by even more people.